Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Positive Planet webinar. Today we'll be having a look at the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM regulation, and what that means for your business. This is the last of a series of webinars, so it'll be the final one today. But before we get started, I just want to give you a quick reminder on some housekeeping points. Please unmute your device after joining so that you can hear the webinar speakers properly. But if you do have any problems with that or anything else, just drop us a comment in the box to the right to let us know, and we'll help you out on that front. If you have any questions throughout, again, pop those in the comments section and we'll try to answer as many of those as we go through or at the end of the session. If we don't manage to get to your question, we'll contact you afterwards to do that as well. The session is being recorded today, so you'll be able to revisit it later, share it with colleagues, whatever you might want to do with that via our YouTube. And the link and the slides for today will be sent to you in a follow-up email afterwards. So with all of that out of the way, I'll quickly introduce Positive Planet to you all, for those of you who don't already know us. So we're a small team helping businesses to turn sustainability goals into real impact. We do everything from emissions measurement and policy updates to ESG guidance and accredited training. Providing really what we aim to do is provide practical support tailored to what matters for each of our clients. So we do tailor that for each and every one that we work with. Today you have myself, Bryony Salter, the Head of Sustainability at Positive Planet, and we have Dr. Michael Kenyon, our Principal LCA Consultant, who will be leading on today's webinar. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Bryony, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on CBAM. As Bryony mentioned, my name is Dr. Michael Kenyon, Principal LCA Consultant at Positive Planet. So I've been delivering lifecycle assessments, product carbon footprints, environmental product declarations for many years, along with other bespoke carbon and environmental assessments. But my career goes all the way back to my PhD in advanced metallics, and it's actually the combination of materials research and sustainability consultancy that allows me to deliver these services to our clients, including support for CBAM. So I'm sure many of you have already been on at least one webinar for CBAM, or this may be relatively new as well. So what I'll do is I'm going to go through a fairly quick and concise introduction to what CBAM is and why, but I'll then focus on the practical implications of what it means for your business, along with the challenges, the opportunities, and the risk. And of course, the next steps with Positive Planet. So what is CBAM? So CBAM is designed to put a fair price on the embedded emissions in certain goods entering the EU or the UK from 1st of January 2027. So throughout this presentation, I will be referring to both the existing EU CBAM and of course the upcoming UK CBAM as well. So what CBAM does is essentially puts a tax on those carbon intensive goods. So the higher the carbon impact of that good entering, there will be an increased tax. So what CBAM is encouraging is an improvement in those sustainable practices for non-EU suppliers importing into the EU or importing into the UK from next year. It also promotes supply chain carbon transparency and also helps with improving those supply chain communications and relationships. It also prevents carbon leakage. So that is when a company might shift production to a country with weaker climate policies or avoids using lower carbon goods from within the internal market. And essentially what CBAM is doing, it's aligning trade with climate targets, and therefore there is a financial implication there for doing that. So you can see, as my previous description from the schematic on the left-hand side, of any goods crossing that border under a certain category will need to report the embedded emissions for those products, or the importer of those products will need to report those emissions. Full implementation of this was 1st of January 2026 for EU importers, and for the UK, the implementation will be from 1st of January 2027. And I'll go through some other key aspects in terms of timelines in a few slides' time. But what goods are we actually talking about? So for EU CBAM, there are 6 categories, from aluminium, iron and steel through to electricity imports. UK CBAM will at least start off with a reduced scope. It will have aluminium, iron and steel, cement, fertilizer and hydrogen, so excludes the imports of electricity. So this means that we need to collect data along the supply chain for these product categories for those products that are imported into those regions. There is a minimum threshold to meet if you are to be within scope for CBAM. Currently for the UK CBAM, it's £50,000 over a rolling 12-month period. For EU CBAM, there's a similar threshold as well. So regarding timelines, there has been a transitional period over the past 2 years for EU CBAM. And within that transitional period, there has been a reporting obligation for those EU importers. And that has been done on a quarterly reporting basis up to the end of 2025. From the 1st of January 2026 was the start of the definitive period. And here there is now a shift from just reporting to also a payment obligation being put in place. But there's also a few changes from the start of the definitive period. The reporting is moving from on a quarterly basis to an annual basis. So the submission for 2026 CBAM certificates is actually at the end of May 2027. But to help with this, the EU Commission are still going to publish on a quarterly basis the commercial aspects of the CBAM certificates that need to be purchased. But that will only need to be surrendered by the end of 31st of May 2027. Moving on from 2027, of course, the EU has a working group who will be adapting and updating the policy. Such things like including other product categories, potentially things like glass, ceramics or chemicals may become in scope of EU CBAM. But also another important aspect from 2027 onwards, there will be a reduction of free allocation under the EU ETS system. So there'll be a full phase-in of CBAM according to embedded emissions and the associated tax with that. So for the UK CBAM, the past couple of years, there's been consultation on the draft policy. So last year, there was the first technical consultation, which was from April to July, with feedback given by the 3rd of July. Full implementation of UK CBAM will be from 1st of January 2027. The first declaration needs to be by May 2028 for the period, 12-month period 2027. However, yesterday, and I'll talk about this in a few slides' time, there was a release of the second technical consultation, which is now open, with feedback required by towards the end of March. And I'll show you how you can get updates on these consultations later. So a bit different to EU CBAM, after the initial 12-month declaration period, they will be shifting to a quarterly reporting and payment basis, so from January 2028 onwards. And again, working groups will update the policy from 2028 onwards. And again, I would suspect that other product categories will probably become in scope of CBAM. What does this mean for your business? I've put together here 5 very high-level steps on what needs to be done. And this can be for both EU CBAM and also UK CBAM with some slight differences. But essentially, the first thing you need to do is understand whether those imports are actually in scope of the CBAM. Once you've done that, it's essentially quite a large and arduous data collection exercise, and that means collecting data along your supply chain. You then need to validate that data, calculate the embedded emissions according to the methodology, and prepare that information in the necessary format, whether it's for EU or UK reporting. Step 6 is more around mitigation, and I'll cover mitigation in a few slides' time. In terms of classifying those imports, it's really comparing the harmonized system codes, commodity codes of your products and the imports or the imports that you're sending into the EU for your EU customer compared to the published list by the EU and UK to see whether they are in scope. And if they are in scope, it's about mapping those import volumes, understanding the countries and where those suppliers are located. In terms of gathering data from your supplier, different levels of maturity around the world regarding the experience in collecting environmental information and activity data like this for these systems. So it might be that your supplier already has embedded emission information for those products, or they may have never even considered collecting this data before, in which they will need some help via dedicated templates and support. And it might be, therefore, that you might need to collect activity data and associated emission factors rather than direct embedded emissions from those suppliers. But once you have that data, it then needs validating. So verifying of those emission factors used, reviewing for completeness and flagging any data gaps, and potentially doing another round of data collection. Calculating those embedded emissions according to the methodology, and that can be done in according to 2 categories essentially, and that's usually defined as direct and indirect specific embedded emissions, where direct is related to process emissions and indirect is related to electricity use. And then preparing for that declaration, as I've already mentioned. So just to go into a little bit more detail in terms of the types of information that you will need to collect for this process, whether it's for current EU customers or potentially EU methodology. Not all the UK methodology, not all of the UK methodology has been published yet, but I would suspect it will be relatively similar to the EU CBAM. So you'd be expected to collect things around production route of those import materials, fuel, electricity consumption, process emissions and material inputs, and then getting an understanding of how you assess and find values for any data gaps is also going to be an important consideration for UK CBAM. And the UK will, as of the EU, publish a default value list of values for those embedded emissions that you can't calculate yourself. And all this comes down to, as I've already mentioned, those direct emissions and indirect emissions. So indirect being electricity and direct being process and mainly fuel combustion as well. So on this particular slide, I wanted to focus in on UK CBAM. So what do you need to do right now? Very much following from this webinar, within the next 24 hours or within the next week, you can take these actions to start to prepare for the upcoming implementation of UK CBAM. So starting from number 1, sign up to the UK CBAM mailing list, where you'll get all the updates for UK CBAM. You can do that by emailing the email in the first bullet point, just ask to be added to the mailing list. Second, you should read the UK government fact sheet on CBAM, which I've added a reference in there. That's a really nice one-pager that gives an overview of the upcoming UK CBAM and any updates that might be coming soon as well. And then if you want a bit more detail, you can look at the November 2025 update document, again, given a link for the third bullet point in step 1 there. But following that, and you can do this again straight away right now, you can start to look at which of the imports might actually come under within scope of UK CBAM by checking the commodity codes against Annex B of the document I've highlighted there, which is source number 2. But you can also see that commodity codes list in the November 2025 update document. If you see that you will be within scope of UK CBAM, then it's probably a good idea to highlight a responsible person or working group within your company who is going to then take on activities related to UK CBAM. And within the UK CBAM documents, you'll see a note to a liable person who ultimately will do the tax return for the CBAM liability. But you can also start to map your supply chain, and you can do this right now for those materials that are within scope. Map your supply chain, look at the countries and the suppliers where they are coming from. Once you have that, step 3, you can actually, with a few assumptions on the embedded emissions of those imports, products, you can actually calculate an estimate for the commercial impact, as the calculations for the liability tax has been published in these fact sheets that I've referenced here. So you can get an idea of what that cost will be. And once you've done that, you can consider mitigation actions to lower that cost, which I'll touch on in the coming slides. But again, UK methodology hasn't been fully released, but looking at EU CBAM, you can get a good idea of the types of information that you'll need, and therefore you can start to pull together the necessary templates for your suppliers. Hopefully the UK government will release supporting materials in terms of templates, communication templates, like the EU has done. So what are the challenges, opportunities and risks here? Just a few challenges that we've come across in supporting some clients with CBAM data collection and declaration. Number 1, sometimes the commodity codes that have been highlighted between the EU importer and the UK exporter don't match, which can complicate things a little bit. Facility level production data and understanding of process level activity data is not something that most organizations currently do, but it's something that is necessary for CBAM. So again, there's a level of new understanding required there. And then supplier engagement is always a challenge. This just adds an extra layer and another time-consuming exercise in trying to collect data from outside your organization. As I mentioned before, organizations across the world have very varied levels of experience with data collection around their own activity data, but also on an environmental information standpoint. And supply chains can be very complex. It might just not be your direct supplier where information needs to come from. If precursor materials are being supplied from further up the supply chain, then information may need to come from there as well. Opportunities and mitigation activities. I've characterized under 4 terms here: decarbonisation, diversification, onshoring, and also the commercial aspects as well. So as I mentioned at the very start, essentially the goods are being taxed dependent on the embedded emissions. So if you can lower the embedded emissions, then there will be a lower tax. So you can lower those embedded emissions by reducing organizational emissions, or reducing scope 3/supply chain emissions. And that can be done by a whole host of different ways, from looking at alternative materials or similar materials with higher recycled content, alternative suppliers, onshoring as well. So bringing that supply chain within the market and avoiding those costs altogether. One aspect I've put under decarbonisation, it's more of not a real decarbonisation, but more of a hypothetical decarbonisation, is by using your actual data as opposed to default values. So in the EU, they're fairly restrictive on the use of default values, but if you are using default values, then they are set very high, and that's to encourage the use of actual data. So it's likely that by using your actual data, you will lower the embedded emissions associated with those imports, and therefore have a lower cost on that. Regarding commercials, once you understand obviously the full liability at hand, you can consider those alternative options and actually calculate therefore what the cost would be, or the new liability, by using those lower carbon alternative solutions. It might be in the future, and this may already be happening, that CBAM related items are being locked into contracts and procurement, where there may be a necessity to supply certain data or to lower emissions to a certain level. So risk, and here I've just highlighted specifically to the UK CBAM. Within the reference at the bottom, so the policy update document, it's highlighted by HMRC that there will be a penalty for not meeting certain obligations. So for example, and you can see this in that public document, there will be penalties for failure to notify, failure to submit, through to failure to comply with an information notice. So it's important, obviously, that companies are starting to get ready for the full implementation of CBAM from 1st of January 2027. And the other mitigation item I've highlighted here, which I've already discussed, is the use of default values, which can lead to an increased CBAM liability, most likely. Just wanted to finish on this slide again, just to summarize what you can do right now for especially UK CBAM. The reason I focused on UK CBAM here is obviously EU CBAM has already been reporting for a number of years. So hopefully your EU customers have already been in touch around the requirements for EU CBAM. But from a UK CBAM point of view, sign up to the mailing list via that email, read the fact sheet, read the detailed update document, have a look at your supply chain, map those imports, confirm a responsible person who will take this forward, or working group within your company. Obviously, for a lot of companies, this is now becoming in addition to people's day-to-day jobs. So therefore, it is important to start getting ready for this now, as time will fly this year, and then full implementation will be from next year, 1st January. And then again, from now, you can start to assess that liability with a few assumptions on embedded emissions. In terms of next steps, if you have any questions about your specific product portfolio, if you want a deeper understanding of how it might affect your specific products, or you just want to understand the level of support that we can offer, then please feel free to book in a session with me via that QR code there. So we do offer from minimal to maximum support depending on where you are in your CBAM journey. So please feel free to book in with me. We'll discuss specifics from your company and your products, and we can put together a quote and timescales on giving you any level of support that you might need.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Michael. Obviously a lot for businesses to get their heads around there. It is quite confusing. We've got sort of 5 minutes-ish for questions, and we do have about 5 questions. So we'll see where we can get to with them. But we'll start with Tom. CO2 data required.
Yeah.
Does this include CO2 equivalent? Do all countries deal on identical basis with credibility?
So on emissions, that depends on the product category that you're within the applicable goods. So aluminium, iron, steel, etc. Each category does state the emissions to where that needs to be included. So for example, iron and steel is just carbon dioxide, whereas aluminium does include some additional elements. And again, there is one document for EU CBAM that specifies exactly which greenhouse gases, which gases need to be included for each product category. And then referring to your second part, do all countries deal on an identical basis? So credibility wise, this is something I haven't mentioned yet, but there will be verification required for the data moving forwards for EU CBAM. So there will be checks on whether the methodologies and calculations have been applied correctly. So that should deal with any credibility issues moving forwards. I hope that fully answers your question. But again, Tom, if you want to talk about specific emissions with your product category, then please feel free to book in with me.
Fabulous. Thank you, Michael. Rochelle asks, could you please speak more to the requirements for independent verification?
Yeah, so I just mentioned that independent verification will be coming in, and the UK CBAM has also alluded to the fact that verification will be required, although off the top of my head, I don't think they've given an exact timescale for that. But I do know it's a much more aggressive timescale than what the EU transitional period was like. So I would suspect that verification will come around quite quickly. In terms of who can verify, I don't have those details to hand, I'm afraid. And I would imagine in schemes like this, there will be accredited authority bodies that will do the verification. So they will have to be verified by probably the EU Commission or HMRC, HMT, so that they themselves are in a position that they can do that verification. But Rochelle, I'll try and dig out a bit more information on, more detailed information on verification, and I'll get in touch on that.
Thank you, Michael. There's more coming in as well. So again, we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. But Sarah asks, if our products are not covered by CBAM under Annex B, but precursor products to make these products are covered, would there be any requirements for us as a business?
That's a good question. So I assume if you're referring to Annex B, you're talking about UK CBAM. And I guess this is where there might be some discrepancy in the commodity codes coming at the point of import versus maybe further up the supply chain. I would suspect that if a precursor does fall under scope, then you will be under scope of CBAM. But again, Sarah, what I would say is if you have those commodity codes to hand, if you drop me an email, I'm happy to check that for you, because there might be some discrepancy there, it sounds like, between the import commodity code and upper stream. So I can help with that if that offline.
Possibly a similar one, if I've understood it correctly. Yeah. But Alex asks, does this include elements inside a finished good or just for raw materials?
Yes. So there's for most commodity codes, it's for simple products, and by simple products, I mean things like, for example, aluminium ingot, steel ingot, some semi-fabricated products. There are also some codes for complex goods, for example, iron and steel pipes and valves and things like that. So it's mostly semi-fabricated goods, but there are some more complex goods in there as well. I would say that, again, the best way to check this is to map those commodity codes with the commodity codes that have been published. So I hope that helps with that.
Great. It's 1 o'clock, so we are at time, but we'll continue with a couple of questions. So please do stay on if you can. Otherwise, you can view the recording after. But I think we'll just do a couple more of these. So Sam asks, which sectors will be most affected by CBAM? And following on, which materials and products will drive the largest tax burdens for organisations?
Good question. Good question. Most affected by CBAM. So, and I think I've seen Tom's comment here as well about the UK maybe not making as much as they used to. So I think these two things have aligned quite nicely. Most affected by CBAM, I think for companies that import goods with high carbon impact will, of course, have a higher tax liability. So those materials such as aluminium can have a high virgin aluminium from facilities that use fossil fuel energy sources, for example, will have a much higher carbon impact compared to energy sources from renewables for virgin aluminium, for example. So aluminium sector could be widely affected, iron and steel as well. Essentially, I think all the product categories are going to be significantly affected as one way or another, but some relatively more than others. And a second part of your question, I think just referring to Tom's comment here as well about UK supply chain making so little, how do we compete? Yeah, it's a good point. It is a good point. And will this help the UK economy start to produce more materials again and start to bring more onshore if possible to lower those costs? But that is more of a medium to long term pipe dream potentially. Yeah, no, it's a great comment, Tom.
Great. And then I think maybe the final one from Alex, are there any exclusions for CBAM such as medical devices?
So a medical device would be classed as a complex product. So that wouldn't be in scope of, say, UK CBAM. But if you were importing the raw materials and manufacturing in the UK, then those raw materials would be, or if they're aluminium, any steel, iron and steel, etc., they would be within scope of CBAM if you meet the minimum threshold of £50,000 over that 12-month period. So it really depends on what you're importing, Alex.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. So I think we'll end there, but I think there were a few that might benefit from getting in contact with you there to talk through the sort of specifics of what they may be manufacturing or importing. But thank you everyone for all of those questions. If we weren't able to cover completely your question today, then obviously do email us, do get in contact with Michael and book in a meeting with him. This was the final webinar in our series for now, but you can catch up on the full series on our YouTube channel, which we will send you the link to in the follow-up email along with the slides for today. And do please check out our 2026 trends report as well, which is now live. And again, you'll be able to access that through the slides that we will send out. But thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everybody for attending. Hopefully that's been really valuable for you, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.